The grocery store checkout line stretched endlessly ahead of me, filled with the usual Sunday afternoon crowd. I grabbed a pack of gum from the impulse rack, more out of boredom than hunger, when I heard someone clearing their throat behind me. I turned around to find a woman with striking silver hair pulled back in an elegant bun, wearing a navy blazer that screamed sophistication. She was holding a single bottle of wine and looking at me with an amused expression. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Excuse me, she said, her voice carrying a slight southern accent. But I think you dropped this. She held up my debit card, which had apparently slipped from my wallet when I fumbled for the gum. Oh wow, thank you so much, I said, taking the card from her manicured fingers. I would have been in serious trouble without this. She smiled, and I noticed her eyes crinkled at the corners in a way that suggested she laughed often. No problem at all. Though I have to say, you look a little young to be shopping alone without supervision. I laughed, thinking she was making a joke about my obvious grocery shopping incompetence. My cart contained nothing but frozen pizzas, energy drinks, and now gum. Well, you're definitely too young for me to be hitting on you in the checkout line, I replied, gesturing toward her with what I thought was charming self-deprecation. She threw back her head and laughed, a genuine, delighted sound that made several other shoppers turn around. Honey, she said, still chuckling, I'm 54 years old. That's definitely not the problem here. The words hit me like a freight train, and I felt my face flush red as the reality of the situation crashed over me. This woman, who I'd somehow convinced myself was too sophisticated and put together to be interested in someone like me, had just revealed she was old enough to be my mother. And worse, she seemed to find my assumption hilarious rather than offensive. My name is Derek Castellanos, and at 28, I thought I had a pretty good handle on reading people and situations. I worked as a software developer for a tech startup in Austin, spent my weekends playing volleyball at Zilker Park, and generally considered myself reasonably smooth when it came to social interactions. That Sunday afternoon at the H-E-B on South Lamar completely shattered that self-image. The woman, who had introduced herself as Margaret Whitfield after we'd both finished paying for our groceries, suggested we grab coffee at the cafe inside the store. I agreed, partly out of curiosity, and partly because I was mortified by my earlier comment and wanted to apologize properly. We found a small table near the window, and as she stirred cream into her coffee, I got my first real look at her. Margaret was undeniably beautiful, but in a way that spoke of confidence earned through decades of living rather than the uncertain prettiness of someone my age. Her silver hair caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows, and when she smiled, it was with the kind of warmth that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. She wore minimal makeup, letting her natural features shine through, and carried herself with a poise that I realized I'd mistaken for aloofness. So, she said, taking a sip of her coffee, tell me about this assumption you made. What exactly made you think I was too young for you? I shifted uncomfortably in my plastic chair. I guess you seem so put together. Sophisticated. I figured you were probably in your early 30s, maybe, and way out of my league professionally and socially. Ah, she nodded knowingly. The classic mistake of equating polish with youth. Honey, I've had 30-plus years to figure out how to dress myself and hold a conversation. At your age, I was wearing shoulder pads that could have taken out a small aircraft and thought frosted tips were the height of sophistication. I couldn't help but laugh at the mental image. Frosted tips, really? Oh, absolutely. It was 1992, and I thought I looked like I belonged in a music video. My daughter still brings it up at family gatherings. She grinned mischievously. Speaking of which, she's probably about your age. 27, works in marketing for a firm in Dallas. The mention of her daughter should have made things awkward, but somehow it didn't. Instead, it made Margaret seem more real, more approachable. What's it like having a kid my age? I asked, genuinely curious. Terrifying and wonderful in equal measure, she replied without hesitation. Emma's incredibly smart and independent, but I still catch myself wanting to give her advice about things she's perfectly capable of handling herself. The hardest part of parenting isn't the sleepless nights when they're babies. It's learning when to step back and let them make their own mistakes. As she talked about her daughter, I found myself studying Margaret's face. There was something magnetic about the way she spoke, a combination of intelligence and warmth that drew you in. She had the kind of laugh lines that suggested she found joy in unexpected places, and when she gestured while talking, her movements were graceful and deliberate. "What about you?" she asked, pulling me from my observations. "What made you end up in Austin? You don't sound like a native Texan." "Good ear," I said. "I'm originally from Portland. Moved here about 3 years ago for work and somehow never left. There's something about this city that gets under your skin, you know?" "I do know," she agreed. "I moved here from Houston about 8 years ago, after my divorce was finalized. I needed a fresh start somewhere that felt different but not completely foreign. Austin turned out to be perfect, all the culture and energy of a big city, but with enough quirks to keep things interesting." The mention of her divorce made me realize how little I actually knew about her situation. Was that a difficult transition? Starting over in a new place? Margaret considered the question carefully, swirling the remaining coffee in her cup. It was the scariest and most liberating thing I'd ever done. I'd been married for 22 years, since I was 24. When it ended, I realized I had no idea who I was as just Margaret, not as someone's wife or someone's mother. Moving to Austin forced me to figure that out. "And what did you discover?" "That I actually like myself quite a bit," she said with a smile that seemed to light up her entire face. "I'd spent so many years defining myself through other people's needs and expectations that I'd forgotten I had my own interests and opinions. It took me about 2 years of living alone before I stopped asking myself what someone else would want me to do and started asking what I wanted to do." I found myself leaning forward, genuinely engaged in her story. "What kinds of things did you discover you wanted to do?" "Well, I learned that I love going to concerts alone. There's something incredibly freeing about being able to focus entirely on the music without worrying about whether your companion is enjoying themselves. I started taking pottery classes, which I'd always wanted to try but never had time for. I joined a book club that meets at a wine bar downtown, which combines two of my favorite things. And I discovered that I actually enjoy cooking for one. I can make exactly what I want without having to consider anyone else's preferences." As she talked, I realized that Margaret represented something I'd never really encountered before. A woman who was completely comfortable with herself and her choices. The women I usually dated were either still figuring out their careers, dealing with roommate drama, or worried about what their parents thought of their life decisions. Margaret radiated a kind of self-possession that was both attractive and slightly intimidating. "That sounds amazing," I said, meaning it. "I don't think I've ever met anyone who seemed so settled in themselves." "It's taken a long time to get here," she admitted. "And it's not like I have everything figured out. I still have moments of doubt and days when I question my choices. But I've learned to trust my instincts and to be okay with the fact that not everyone will understand or approve of my decisions." "What kind of decisions?" I asked, then immediately worried I was prying too much. "Sorry, that's probably too personal." "Not at all," she said, waving off my concern. "I'm pretty much an open book these days. I figure life's too short to waste time on pretense. For example, I decided to stop dyeing my hair about 2 years ago. My hairdresser thought I was having some kind of breakdown, but I was tired of spending 3 hours every 6 weeks covering up something that was completely natural. My ex-husband would have hated it. He was very particular about maintaining appearances, but I love it." I looked at her silver hair again, noticing how it seemed to shimmer in different lights. "It looks incredible on you. Very distinguished." "Thank you," she said, seeming genuinely pleased by the compliment. "It's funny how much mental energy I was spending on something so trivial. Now I use that time and money for things that actually matter to me." Our conversation was interrupted by the cafe staff beginning to clean up around us. I glanced at my watch and was shocked to see that we'd been talking for nearly 2 hours. The grocery store was preparing to close, and the late afternoon sun was casting long shadows across the parking lot. "I should probably let you get going," I said reluctantly. "I imagine you have better things to do on a Sunday evening than listen to a confused 20-something ramble about his life." Margaret gathered her purse and stood up, and I found myself hoping this wouldn't be the last time I saw her. "Actually," she said, "this has been one of the most interesting conversations I've had in months." Most people my age are either complaining about their teenagers or bragging about their golf handicaps. It's refreshing to talk to someone who asks genuine questions and actually listens to the answers. We walked out to the parking lot together, and she stopped next to a pristine silver BMW sedan that somehow perfectly matched her elegant but understated style. "Derek," she said, turning to face me, "I'm going to say something that might sound presumptuous, but I'd like to see you again. Not because I'm looking for some kind of dramatic romance or trying to recapture my youth, but because I enjoyed talking with you, and I think you might enjoy some of the things I do around town." I felt my heart rate pick up, though I wasn't entirely sure why. "What kind of things?" "Well, there's a jazz quartet playing at the Continental Club on Thursday night. They're phenomenal, and I was planning to go alone, which I genuinely enjoy. But it might be fun to have someone to discuss the music with afterward. No pressure, no expectations, just good music and conversation." I found myself nodding before I'd fully processed what she was suggesting. "That sounds great, actually. I've never been to the Continental Club." "Perfect," she said, pulling out her phone. "Give me your number and I'll text you the details." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As we exchanged contact information, I realized that Margaret had just asked me out, or at least asked me to join her for an evening that sounded suspiciously like a date. The woman who was old enough to be my mother, who I had initially dismissed as being too young for me in a moment of spectacular social misjudgment, was interested enough in continuing our conversation to suggest we spend an evening together. "I'll see you Thursday," she said, getting into her car. "And Derek? Wear something nice, but not too formal. The Continental Club has character, and you'll want to fit in." As I watched her drive away, I stood in the parking lot trying to process what had just happened. In the span of 2 hours, my assumptions about age, attraction, and social dynamics had been completely upended by a gracious woman with silver hair and enough confidence to ask a younger man to accompany her to a jazz show. I drove home in a daze, replaying our conversation and trying to understand what I was feeling. It wasn't quite attractive in the way I usually experienced it, but it wasn't purely platonic either. Margaret had a magnetic quality that drew me in, a combination of intelligence, humor, and self-assurance that I found incredibly appealing. She seemed to exist in a world where social conventions mattered less than genuine connection, and I found myself curious about what that world might look like. By the time Thursday rolled around, I had changed my outfit 3 times and spent an embarrassing amount of time researching jazz terminology online. I arrived at the Continental Club 15 minutes early, only to find Margaret already there, sitting at a small table near the stage with a glass of red wine and an amused expression on her face. "Nervous?" she asked as I sat down across from her. "A little," I admitted. "I'm not exactly sure what I'm doing here." "You're here to listen to some incredible music and have a conversation with someone who finds you interesting," she said simply. "That's it. No hidden agenda, no complicated expectations. Just enjoy the evening." The Continental Club buzzed with an energy I hadn't expected. The walls were covered in vintage concert posters and neon signs, giving the place a lived-in authenticity that made me understand why Margaret had chosen it. She looked perfectly at home in the dimly lit venue, wearing a burgundy silk blouse and dark jeans that managed to look both casual and sophisticated. "First time here?" she asked, sliding a beer across the small table toward me. "Yeah, I usually stick to the newer places downtown. This has so much more character." "Austin's real music scene isn't in the shiny new venues," Margaret said, settling back in her chair. "It's in places like this, where the floorboards have absorbed decades of good music and the bartenders know everyone's story." The jazz quartet took the stage without fanfare, 4 musicians who looked like they'd been playing together for years. The bassist, a tall black man with graying temples, nodded to Margaret as he adjusted his instrument. She raised her wine, glass slightly in acknowledgement. "You know him?" I asked. "Charles Brennan. We've talked a few times after shows. He used to tour with some fairly big names back in the day. Now he plays here every few weeks and teaches music at ACC during the day." She leaned forward slightly as the music began. "Listen to how he anchors the whole group." As the quartet launched into their first song, I found myself watching Margaret as much as the musicians. Her face lit up during a particularly complex saxophone solo, and she moved slightly to the rhythm in a way that suggested she felt the music as much as heard it. When the bassist took his turn, she closed her eyes and smiled, completely absorbed in the sound. Between sets, we talked about music, but also about Austin, work, and the strange social dynamics of being single in a city where everyone seemed to be either paired off or 22 years old. "Do you date much?" Margaret asked, with the directness I was learning was characteristic of her. "Not as much as I probably should," I admitted. "Most of the women I meet through work are either colleagues, which gets complicated, or they're at the same life stage I am, still figuring things out professionally and personally. It gets exhausting sometimes, all that uncertainty." "And you prefer certainty?" I considered the question while watching Charles tune his bass for the second set. "I guess I prefer intention. Knowing what you want and being honest about it. Most people my age are still trying on different versions of themselves to see what fits." Margaret nodded thoughtfully. "I remember that phase. It's necessary, but it's also exhausting for everyone involved. I spent my 20s becoming the person I thought I should be, and my 30s figuring out that person wasn't actually me." "What changed?" "Life happened. Marriage, career, motherhood. They all forced me to confront who I actually was versus who I thought I wanted to be. The divorce was the final push toward authenticity. When everything I'd built my identity around fell apart, I had to discover what was left underneath." The music started again, preventing further conversation, but I found myself thinking about what she'd said. There was something appealing about the idea of being with someone who had already done the work of becoming themselves, who wasn't still experimenting with different personas or trying to figure out their basic values and priorities. After the show, we walked slowly toward the parking lot. The night air was warm, and South Congress was still busy with people bar hopping and enjoying the Austin nightlife. "There's a late-night taco truck about 6 blocks from here that makes the best al pastor in the city," Margaret said. "Are you hungry?" I realized I was starving. We'd been so focused on the music that I'd barely touched the appetizer we'd ordered. "Lead the way." The taco truck sat in the parking lot of a closed auto repair shop, surrounded by a mix of late-night workers, college students, and what appeared to be several other couples on dates. We ordered at the window and found seats at one of the picnic tables under string lights that had been hung between the truck and a nearby tree. "This is perfect," I said, biting into a taco that was indeed incredible. "How do you know about places like this?" 8 years of exploring the city on my own," Margaret replied. "When you're not rushing home to make dinner for a family or coordinating your schedule with someone else's preferences, you have time to wander and discover things. I probably eat at food trucks more than I should, but I love the adventure of finding new places." "Do you miss it? Being married, I mean." She was quiet for a moment, considering the question while she ate. "I miss some things about it. Having someone to share daily experiences with, having a built-in date for social events, the comfort of routine and shared responsibilities. But I don't miss the compromise and negotiation that goes into every decision, or the feeling that I was living someone else's idea of what my life should look like." "Was your ex-husband controlling?" "Not in an obvious way. He wasn't abusive or deliberately manipulative. But he had very strong opinions about how things should be done, and I spent so many years deferring to those opinions that I forgot I had my own. It was death by 1,000 small surrenders. Agreeing to his restaurant choices, his vacation preferences, his social circle, his timeline for major life decisions. By the time I realized what had happened, I wasn't sure who I would be without his input." I set down my taco, struck by the sadness in her voice. "That sounds lonely." It was. Lonelier than actually being alone, which is saying something. She looked up at me with a rueful smile. "Sorry, I don't mean to sound bitter. The divorce was the right choice for both of us. He's happier with someone who genuinely shares his preferences, and I'm happier making my own choices, even when they're wrong." "What kind of wrong choices have you made?" She laughed, and the sadness lifted from her expression. "Oh, plenty. I bought a motorcycle about 6 months after the divorce, convinced I was going to become some kind of adventurous biker woman. Turns out I'm terrified of highway speeds and sold it after 3 months. I tried online dating for exactly 2 weeks before deciding it was like shopping for humans in a catalog. I took a pottery class that was way too advanced and made the most lopsided bowls you've ever seen. Do you still have the bowls? Every single one. They're terrible, but they're mine, you know? Evidence that I tried something new, even if I wasn't good at it. We finished our tacos and walked back toward our cars, which were parked near each other outside the Continental Club. The evening felt like it was winding down naturally, without the awkward tension that often accompanied the end of dates. "Thank you for tonight," I said as we reached her BMW. I had no idea what to expect, but this was really great. "I'm glad you enjoyed it. Charles and his group are some of the best musicians in the city. Most people don't take the time to really listen to live music anymore. They're too busy, taking photos for social media or talking through the performance." "Is that a generational thing, you think?" Margaret shrugged. "Maybe partly, but I think it's more about being present in the moment versus documenting it for later. I've learned to put my phone away during experiences I want to actually have." She unlocked her car but didn't get in immediately. "Derek, can I ask you something?" "Of course." "What are you looking for, in terms of this?" She gestured between us. "I don't want to make assumptions about what tonight meant to you or what you might be hoping will happen." The question caught me off guard, partly because of her directness, and partly because I wasn't entirely sure of the answer myself. Honestly, I'm not sure. I know I enjoyed talking with you more than I've enjoyed talking with anyone in a long time. I know I find you interesting and attractive in a way that's different from what I'm used to. Beyond that, I'm kind of figuring it out as I go." She nodded, seeming satisfied with my honesty. "Good. That's a refreshing answer. Most people either pretend they have no expectations or they assume way too much too quickly. What about you? What are you looking for?" "Connection, I suppose. Not necessarily romance, though I'm not opposed to it. Just genuine human connection. With someone who sees me as I am, rather than as they think I should be. Tonight felt like that kind of connection, which is rare enough to be worth exploring further. So we'll do this again?" "I'd like to, if you would. Though next time, maybe something during daylight hours. I know a great farmer's market on Saturday mornings, and there's usually live music. Very different energy from tonight, but equally authentic Austin. I'd love that." As I watched her drive away, I realized that Margaret had managed to articulate something I'd been struggling to understand about my own dating experiences. Most of the relationships I'd had felt like elaborate performances, with both people trying to present their best selves while carefully managing expectations and avoiding difficult conversations. Tonight felt refreshingly real. Two people talking honestly about their lives and experiences without trying to impress each other or manage outcomes. The drive home gave me time to process what was happening. I was attracted to Margaret, but it wasn't the urgent, complicated attraction I usually felt for women my age. It was something calmer and more sustainable, based on genuine respect and interest rather than projection and possibility. She didn't represent some idealized version of what my life could become. She was simply herself, take it or leave it, with no apologies or explanations required. By Saturday morning, I found myself looking forward to the farmer's market with an anticipation that surprised me. I arrived at the designated spot, a coffee stand near the entrance to the Barton Creek Market, and spotted Margaret immediately. She was wearing a sundress and sandals, with her silver hair loose around her shoulders, looking completely at ease as she chatted with the coffee vendor, in Spanish. "You speak Spanish?" I asked, joining her at the counter. "Enough to get by. Living in Texas, it comes in handy more often than you'd think." She handed me a cup of coffee and gestured toward the market stalls. Ready for the full Austin experience? The Barton Creek Farmers Market sprawled across several acres of parkland, filled with vendors selling everything from organic vegetables to handmade jewelry. Margaret moved through the stalls with the confidence of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for, stopping to examine heirloom tomatoes and sample local honey while maintaining running conversations with vendors who clearly recognized her as a regular customer. "You're like a local celebrity here," I observed as we left a booth where the vendor had insisted on giving Margaret an extra jar of peach preserves. "I've been coming here almost every Saturday for 6 years," she said, adding the preserves to a canvas bag that was already filling up with fresh produce. "These people work incredibly hard to bring quality food to the community. The least I can do is be a loyal customer and treat them like the small business owners they are." We paused at a booth selling fresh pasta, where Margaret ordered something in Italian that made the elderly woman behind the counter beam with delight. They chatted for several minutes in rapid Italian while I stood there feeling slightly overwhelmed by yet another language Margaret seemed to speak fluently. Italy was my first solo trip after the divorce, she explained as we walked away with packages of handmade ravioli. I spent 3 weeks in Tuscany, staying in small towns and eating at family restaurants. By the end of the trip, I'd picked up enough Italian to get by, and I've been practicing with Maria here ever since. 3 weeks in Italy alone? That sounds incredible. It was terrifying and amazing. I'd never traveled internationally without my ex-husband, and I was convinced I'd get lost or make some terrible cultural mistake. Instead, I discovered that I'm actually quite good at navigating new places and talking to strangers. I came back feeling like I could handle pretty much anything. We found seats at a picnic table near a small stage where a bluegrass trio was setting up their instruments. Margaret unpacked some of her purchases: fresh strawberries, artisanal cheese, and crusty bread from a local bakery, creating an impromptu breakfast spread between us. "This is perfect," I said, biting into a strawberry that was sweeter than anything I'd ever tasted from a grocery store. I had no idea food could taste this different when it's actually fresh. "Most people my age are set in their grocery shopping routines," Margaret said, spreading soft cheese on a piece of bread. "But I figure if I'm going to eat alone most of the time, I might as well eat really well. Good food is one of life's reliable pleasures." The bluegrass trio began their first song, and Margaret's face lit up with recognition. "I love this song," she said softly, moving slightly to the rhythm. "My grandfather used to play mandolin, and he'd sing this to me when I was little." Watching her listen to the music, I found myself studying the way she inhabited moments completely. Whether she was talking to vendors, tasting food, or listening to music, Margaret seemed fully present in a way that was both enviable and slightly foreign to me. I realized that I spend most of my time either thinking about what I needed to do next or processing what had just happened, rarely just existing in the current moment. "You're very good at this," I said during a break between songs. "Good at what?" "Being present. Actually experiencing things instead of just going through the motions." Margaret considered this while she watched the musicians tune their instruments. "I had to learn how to do that. For most of my marriage, I was always thinking 3 steps ahead. What needed to be done for the house, for Emma, for my husband's career. I was managing everyone else's life and missing my own. It took a couple of years of therapy after the divorce to figure out how to just be where I was. Therapy helped? Immensely. I had to unlearn a lot of patterns I'd developed over 20-plus years of marriage. The habit of automatically deferring to someone else's preferences, the tendency to anticipate problems that might never happen, the assumption that my own wants and needs were somehow less important than everyone else's." She paused to listen as the band started a new song. "It's ongoing work, honestly. Sometimes I still catch myself falling back into old patterns." "What kind of old patterns?" "Oh, little things mostly. Like automatically ordering something I think the other person would prefer when we're sharing food, or suggesting activities based on what I think someone else would enjoy rather than what I actually want to do. Last week, I almost bought tickets to a comedy show because I thought you might like it, even though I'm not particularly fond of stand-up comedy." I laughed, partly at the image of Margaret sitting through a comedy show she didn't enjoy for my benefit, and partly at the recognition that she'd been thinking about me enough to consider future activities we might do together. "What would you have preferred instead?" "There's a small art gallery downtown that's featuring local photographers this month. The opening reception is next Friday evening. Much more my speed than a comedy club, but I wasn't sure if you'd find it interesting. I'd love to go to an art gallery with you. I don't know much about photography, but I'd like to learn." Margaret smiled, and I could see her making a mental note. "Good. It's important to be honest about preferences, even small ones. They add up over time." The farmers' market was getting busier as the morning progressed, filling up with families and couples doing their weekly shopping. I noticed that Margaret and I seemed to be drawing some attention. Not hostile, but curious glances from other shoppers who were clearly trying to figure out our relationship. "Does it bother you?" I asked. "People staring?" "Not really. I spent too many years worrying about what other people thought of my choices. Besides, they're probably just trying to figure out if you're my son or my boyfriend. Which is admittedly a reasonable question given the circumstances." The casual way she mentioned the possibility of being my boyfriend made something flutter in my chest. We hadn't defined what we were doing, and I appreciated that Margaret didn't seem interested in forcing premature labels on our connection. But hearing her acknowledge the romantic potential of our relationship made me realize that I was hoping for exactly that. For what it's worth, I said, I hope they find a boyfriend. Margaret's eyebrows rose slightly, and she smiled in a way that made me feel like I'd just passed some kind of test. Good to know where you stand. We finished our impromptu breakfast and continued wandering through the market, stopping at booths that caught Margaret's interest. She bought a small succulent plant for her kitchen windowsill, a bar of handmade soap that smelled like lavender, and a pair of silver earrings crafted by a local artisan. Everything she chose seemed purposeful rather than impulsive, selected because it would genuinely enhance her daily life in some way. You shop very intentionally, I observed. I've learned to ask myself whether I actually want something or just think I should want it. Makes a big difference in how much stuff I end up with, and how much I actually use what I buy. As we headed back toward the parking area, Margaret stopped at a booth selling fresh flowers. She spent several minutes examining different bouquets before selecting a mix of sunflowers and white roses that somehow perfectly captured the essence of the morning. Bright, cheerful, and elegant without being fussy. For your dining room. Table? I asked. Actually, these are for you, for your apartment. Every space needs something living and beautiful. And I'm guessing you don't usually buy yourself flowers. She was right. I'd never bought flowers for myself, and my apartment was pretty sparse when it came to anything decorative or beautiful. The gesture touched me more than I expected, both because it was thoughtful, and because it suggested she'd been thinking about my living space, and how to make it more pleasant. Thank you, I said, accepting the bouquet. That's incredibly sweet. It's practical too. Flowers make a space feel more like home, and less like a place you just happen to sleep. Trust me on this. As we reached our cars, I found myself reluctant to end the morning. The farmer's market had felt like a glimpse into a different way of living. More intentional, more connected to the community, more focused on quality over convenience. Margaret moved through her Saturday routine with a contentment that I envied and wanted to understand better. Same time next week? She asked, unlocking her car. Absolutely. Though I should probably learn some basic Spanish before then, since apparently everyone here speaks at least 3 languages. Margaret laughed. I'll teach you some useful phrases. It's not as hard as you think, and it makes the whole experience richer when you can connect with people in their preferred language. Is there anything you can't do? Plenty, she said with a grin. I'm terrible at anything requiring hand-eye coordination. I can't parallel park to save my life, and I have absolutely no sense of direction. But I've gotten pretty good at the things that matter to me, which is really all any of us can hope for. The photography gallery opening was unlike anything I'd experienced before. The space itself was intimate, a converted warehouse in East Austin, with exposed brick walls and polished concrete floors that created the perfect backdrop for the black and white photographs lining the walls. Margaret arrived wearing a black dress that managed to be both sophisticated and understated, with her silver hair swept up in a way that highlighted the elegant curve of her neck. The photographer is named Samuel Rodriguez, she explained as we accepted glasses of wine from a server. He's been documenting the changing face of Austin for the past 15 years. This series focuses on longtime residents who've watched their neighborhoods transform around them. As we moved through the gallery, Margaret pointed out technical aspects of the photographs I never would have noticed on my own. The way Rodriguez used natural light to create depth, how he positioned his subjects to tell stories about resilience and adaptation. Her knowledge wasn't academic. It was the kind of informed appreciation that comes from genuine interest and years of paying attention. This one is my favorite, she said, stopping in front of a portrait of an elderly Mexican woman standing in front of a house that was clearly being renovated around her. Look at her expression. She's not angry about the changes, but she's not celebrating them either. She's just enduring with dignity. I studied the photograph, trying to see what Margaret saw. The woman's face was lined with age and experience, her hands folded calmly in front of her while construction equipment sat in the background. There was something powerful about the contrast between her stillness and the obvious upheaval happening around her. Rodriguez spent 6 months getting to know her before he took this shot, Margaret continued. Her name is Rosa Delgado, and she's lived in that house for 43 years. Her property taxes have tripled in the past decade, but she refuses to sell because it's where she raised her children. How do you know all this? I talk to the artists when I go to openings. Most people just look at the photographs and move on, but the stories behind them are usually fascinating. Rodriguez is over there by the wine table. I'll introduce you later. We continued through the gallery, and I found myself watching Margaret as much as the art. She had a way of looking at each photograph that was both analytical and emotional, taking time to really see what the artist was trying to communicate. When she liked something, her whole face would light up with appreciation. When something moved her, she would go very still and quiet, absorbing the image completely. You really love this, I observed as we paused in front of a series showing children playing in the streets of East Austin. Art has always been important to me, but I never had time to really pursue it when I was married. Richard thought gallery openings were pretentious, and he preferred to spend our free time on activities that were more practical. She gestured toward the photographs around us. This feels like luxury to me, having the time and freedom to appreciate something beautiful just because it exists. What other things did you miss out on? Margaret considered the question while we looked at a striking image of an older man playing guitar on a front porch. Travel, mostly. Richard was very focused on building his business, so our vacations were always brief and close to home. I dreamed about going to Morocco, or taking a train through Scotland, or spending a month learning to cook in France. He thought those ideas were impractical and expensive. And now? Now I'm planning a trip to Scotland for next spring. I've already booked a cottage in the Highlands for 2 weeks. I'm going to rent a car and drive wherever looks interesting, stay in small villages, and eat in local pubs. It's going to be exactly the kind of unstructured adventure that would have given Richard anxiety attacks. The enthusiasm in her voice when she talked about her Scotland trip was infectious. I found myself imagining what it would be like to travel with someone who approached new experiences with such genuine curiosity and openness. That sounds incredible, I said. Are you nervous about going alone? A little, but mostly excited. I've discovered that I actually enjoy my own company, which was a surprise. When you've been part of a couple for over 20 years, you forget what it's like to make decisions without consulting someone else, or to change plans on a whim because something catches your interest. We were interrupted by Samuel Rodriguez, himself, who approached us with a warm smile and thanked Margaret for coming to his opening. She introduced me as her friend Derek, and soon we were deep in conversation about the challenges of documenting urban change without exploiting the communities being photographed. The key is time and respect, Rodriguez explained. You can't just show up with a camera and expect people to trust you with their stories. I spend months in each neighborhood, shopping at local stores, eating at neighborhood restaurants, becoming part of the community before I ever take a picture. How do you decide which stories to tell? I asked, genuinely curious. Usually the stories choose me. I'll meet someone like Rosa, and her experience will represent something larger about what's happening in the city. But it's always about the individual first, their personality, their resilience, their particular way of navigating change. Margaret asked technical questions about his photographic process that revealed a depth of knowledge I hadn't expected. She understood concepts like depth of field and composition in ways that suggested she'd spent time studying photography herself. Do you take pictures? I asked as Rodriguez moved on to greet other guests. I'm learning. I bought a good camera about a year ago, and I've been taking a class at the community college. Nothing as sophisticated as Samuel's work, but I'm enjoying the process of learning to see differently. What kind of things do you photograph? Architecture, mostly. I love the way Austin's history is layered into its buildings. You can see different decades of growth and change just by looking at how neighborhoods developed. And flowers, though that's probably predictable for a woman my age. The self-deprecating comment bothered me more than it should have. Why would that be predictable? If you enjoy photographing flowers, that's what matters. Margaret looked at me with surprise, as if she hadn't expected me to push back on her assumption. You're right. I suppose I still worry sometimes about conforming to stereotypes about older women and their hobbies. From what I can tell, you don't conform to any stereotypes about anything. Thank you for that, she said, and I could tell the comment meant something to her. It's still a work in progress, learning to stop apologizing for my interests or trying to justify them. We spent another hour at the gallery, during which Margaret introduced me to several other artists and gallery regulars. I was struck by how easily she moved through this community, how people seemed genuinely happy to see her and interested in her opinions about the work. She'd clearly built real relationships here, not just casual acquaintanceships. As the evening wound down, we found ourselves standing outside the gallery in the warm Austin night. The street was busy with people, heading to restaurants and bars, and I could hear live music coming from several different venues. "Are you hungry?" Margaret asked. "There's a new restaurant about 3 blocks from here that I've been wanting to try. They focus on locally sourced ingredients, and the chef trained in New Orleans." "That sounds perfect," I said, realizing that I was in no hurry for the evening to end. The restaurant was small and intimate, with only about 15 tables and a menu that changed based on what ingredients were available that day. Margaret spoke briefly with the hostess in what sounded like French, and we were seated at a table by the window that offered a view of the busy street outside. "French too?" I asked as we settled into our seats. "Just enough to get by in restaurants and hotels. I took classes in college but never had much opportunity to practice until I started traveling more. The chef here is from Lyon, and she appreciates it when customers make an effort." As we looked over the menu, Margaret explained various dishes and ingredients with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved food and cooking. She ordered for both of us, after checking what I liked and didn't like, and somehow managed to select dishes that were both adventurous and perfectly suited to my tastes. "How did you know I'd like this?" I asked after tasting the first course, which was unlike anything I'd ever eaten but absolutely delicious. "You seem open to new experiences, and you trusted me enough to let me order. That usually means someone will enjoy well-prepared food even if it's unfamiliar. Is that your philosophy about life in general? That openness leads to good experiences?" Margaret considered the question while she tasted her wine. "Mostly, yes. Obviously you have to use some judgment about risks and safety. But in general, I've found that saying yes to new experiences leads to a richer life than saying no out of fear or habit." "What's the most adventurous thing you've done since your divorce?" "Probably the motorcycle," she laughed. "Though the solo trip to Italy was pretty bold for someone who'd never traveled internationally alone. What about you? What's the most adventurous thing you've ever done?" I thought about it while I ate, realizing that my definition of adventure was probably quite different from Margaret's. "Moving to Austin, maybe? I didn't know anyone here and I'd never lived anywhere but the Pacific Northwest. It felt like a huge risk at the time." "That is a big risk. Starting over in a new city takes courage, especially when you're young and still figuring out your career and social life. It doesn't feel very adventurous compared to buying motorcycles and traveling to Italy alone." "Adventure is relative," Margaret said gently. "What feels risky and exciting to one person might feel routine to someone else. The important thing is that you took a chance on something that could have improved your life, and it worked out." Her words made me think about the chance I was taking with her, pursuing a connection that didn't fit any conventional pattern, with someone whose life experience was so different from my own. It was certainly the most adventurous thing I'd done romantically, though I wasn't sure I was ready to admit that out loud yet. 3 weeks into what I'd started thinking of as whatever this was with Margaret, I got a text that changed everything. It was Tuesday afternoon, and I was debugging code when my phone buzzed with a message that simply read, "Emergency with Emma. Rain check on tonight?" I immediately called her, my mind racing through possible scenarios. Margaret answered on the first ring, and I could hear stress in her voice despite her attempt to sound calm. "What happened? Is Emma okay?" "She's physically fine, but emotionally, it's complicated. Her boyfriend of 2 years just broke up with her, and she's driving down from Dallas tonight. She needs her mom." "Of course," I said, relief flooding through me that it wasn't a medical emergency. "Do whatever you need to do. We can reschedule. Thank you for understanding. I know we were supposed to try that new wine bar tonight, but..." "Margaret, seriously. Your daughter needs you. Everything else can wait." There was a pause, and when she spoke again, her voice was softer. "You continue to surprise me in the best ways." "What's surprising about putting family first?" "My ex-husband used to get annoyed when Emma's needs interfered with our plans. He saw it as poor planning on my part, rather than just life happening." The comment gave me another glimpse into why Margaret's marriage had ended, but I didn't want to dwell on her ex-husband when she was dealing with a family crisis. Is there anything I can do to help? Actually, she hesitated. This might sound strange, but would you mind if I called you later? Sometimes it helps to talk through parenting situations with someone who has an outside perspective. I'd be honored, I said, meaning it completely. Margaret called around 11 that night, after Emma had arrived and they'd spent several hours talking through the breakup. We ended up on the phone for over an hour while Margaret processed her own emotions about watching her adult daughter navigate heartbreak. The hardest part is knowing when to offer advice and when to just listen, she said. Emma's 27, incredibly capable, and she doesn't need me to fix her problems. But watching your child hurt never gets easier, regardless of their age. What kind of advice does she want? That's just it. She doesn't want advice. She wants validation that her feelings are legitimate, and permission to be sad without having to immediately start looking for the silver lining, which is actually very mature, but it goes against every motherly instinct I have to make things better. I found myself thinking about my own mother, who had a tendency to jump straight into problem-solving mode whenever I shared any kind of personal struggle. It sounds like Emma knows what she needs from you. She does, and I'm trying to respect that. But it's hard not to point out that this guy was never quite right for her, or that she's better off without someone who would end a 2-year relationship over text message. He broke up with her over text. At 7:30 on a Tuesday morning, while she was getting ready for work. Apparently he'd been thinking about it for weeks, but didn't want to have an uncomfortable conversation. That's awful. Emma said the same thing. But she also said she's more angry about his cowardice than heartbroken about losing him, which suggests she already knew the relationship had problems. She's remarkably emotionally intelligent, which I take no credit for. I doubt that's true. Kids learn emotional intelligence somewhere. Maybe. Though I worry sometimes that I modeled the wrong things during her childhood. Staying in a marriage that wasn't working, prioritizing other people's comfort over my own needs. I don't want her to make the same mistakes I did. The vulnerability in Margaret's voice made something shift in my chest. This was a side of her I hadn't seen before. The worried mother, questioning her choices and their impact on her child. It made her seem more human and somehow more attractive than the confident woman I'd been getting to know. For what it's worth, I said. Emma sounds like she's learned to recognize when relationships aren't working and to prioritize her own emotional well-being. Those are pretty valuable skills. Thank you for saying that. Sometimes I need an outside perspective to see the positives. We talked for another 20 minutes about parenting, relationships, and the strange experience of watching your children become adults with their own complicated lives. By the time we hung up, I felt like I understood Margaret in a deeper way. And I was touched that she'd trusted me with her concerns about Emma. The next morning, I did something impulsive. I stopped at a bakery near my office and bought a selection of pastries, then drove to Margaret's house with coffee and breakfast for 3. I'd never been to her home before, but I figured if Emma was still there, they might appreciate not having to think about food. Margaret answered the door in jeans and an oversized sweater, looking more casual than I'd ever seen her. Her hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and she wasn't wearing any makeup, but somehow she looked even more beautiful than usual. "Derek, what are you doing here?" "I brought breakfast," I said, holding up the bags. "I thought you and Emma might be too emotionally exhausted to deal with cooking." Her face lit up with genuine surprise and gratitude. "That's incredibly thoughtful. Come in, I'll introduce you to Emma." Margaret's house was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant, but comfortable. Filled with books and art and plants that created a sense of warmth and personality. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I could immediately see the resemblance to her mother. She had Margaret's intelligent eyes and expressive face, though her hair was dark brown and cut in a modern bob. "Emma, this is Derek," Margaret said as I set the pastries and coffee on the counter. "Derek, my daughter Emma." Margaret's house was exactly what I'd expected. Elegant but comfortable, filled with books and art and plants that created a sense of warmth and personality. Emma was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea, and I could immediately see the resemblance to her mother. She had Margaret's intelligent eyes and expressive face, though her hair was dark brown and cut in a modern bob. "Emma, this is Derek," Margaret said as I set the pastries and coffee on the counter. "Derek, my daughter Emma." "Nice to meet you." Emma said, studying me with undisguised curiosity. Mom's mentioned you. All good things, I hope. Intriguing things, Emma replied with a small smile that reminded me exactly of Margaret's mischievous expressions. As we sat around the kitchen table sharing croissants and coffee, I watched the dynamic between Margaret and Emma with fascination. They clearly had a close relationship, but it was built on mutual respect rather than the kind of boundary-blurring intimacy I'd seen in some mother-daughter pairs. Emma talked openly about her breakup, her feelings, and her plans for moving forward, while Margaret listened and asked thoughtful questions without trying to direct the conversation. I keep thinking I should be more upset, Emma said, pulling apart a chocolate croissant. 2 years is a long time to be with someone, but mostly I just feel relieved, which probably means the relationship was over long before yesterday. Feeling relieved doesn't mean you didn't care about him, Margaret said gently. It might just mean you recognized something wasn't right even if you couldn't articulate it yet. That's exactly it, Emma said, looking grateful to have her feelings validated. I kept thinking we should be happier together, or that I should miss him more when he traveled for work. Instead, I felt lighter when he wasn't around. Trust those instincts, I found myself saying. They're usually telling you something important. Emma looked at me with interest. Do you think people know when relationships aren't working, even if they don't want to admit it? I think people often know, I said, glancing at Margaret. But sometimes it takes courage to act on that knowledge, especially when the relationship isn't obviously terrible. Exactly, Emma said with enthusiasm. Jake wasn't abusive or mean. He was just wrong for me, which made it harder to justify ending things, even though staying felt like settling. Margaret reached across the table and squeezed Emma's hand. You deserve someone who makes you feel excited about your life, not someone who makes you feel like you're just going through the motions. Like you and Derek? Emma asked with a directness that made both Margaret and me freeze. Emma, Margaret warned. What? It's obvious you two are more than friends and you seem genuinely happy when you talk about him. I'm just saying it's nice to see you with someone who appreciates you. The comment hung in the air for a moment before Margaret laughed. My daughter, ladies and gentlemen, subtle as a brick. I get it from you, Emma shot back. Remember when you told Dad's girlfriend that her highlights looked like they were done with bleach and a paintbrush? That was different. She asked for my opinion. She asked if you liked her hair. You gave her a technical critique of her colorist's technique. Watching them tease each other, I could see where Margaret had learned some of her directness and humor. Emma had the same sharp wit and lack of filter, though tempered by youth and perhaps fewer years of learning to soften her observations for social politeness. I should probably head to work, I said after we'd finished breakfast. But Emma, I'm sorry about the breakup, and I'm glad you have such a great mom to help you process everything. Thanks for breakfast, Emma said. And Derek, take good care of my mom. She deserves someone who sees how amazing she is. As Margaret walked me to the door, I could feel the weight of Emma's comment settling between us. We hadn't explicitly discussed the romantic potential of our relationship, but Emma's observation made it clear that whatever was happening between us was obvious to outside observers. Thank you for this morning, Margaret said as we reached my car. Breakfast, meeting Emma, just being exactly the kind of person I hoped you were. What kind of person is that? The kind who shows up when it matters, she said simply. That's rarer than you might think. Emma stayed with Margaret for the rest of the week, and during that time, our usual routine of evening dinners and weekend activities shifted into something more complex and revealing. Margaret invited me to join them for a few casual meals, and I found myself experiencing their relationship from the inside rather than just hearing about it secondhand. Thursday evening, the three of us were sitting on Margaret's back patio, sharing a bottle of wine while Emma grilled us about how we'd met. Margaret had transformed her small backyard into an oasis of sorts. String lights hung between mature oak trees, comfortable outdoor furniture arranged around a small fire, pit and planters full of herbs and flowers that filled the air with the scent of lavender and rosemary. So you literally told my mother she was too young for you? Emma asked, clearly delighted by the story. In a grocery store checkout line? In my defense, I said, refilling our wine glasses, Your mother is incredibly intimidating when you first meet her. She has this aura of having her life completely figured out. She does have her life figured out, Emma said with obvious pride. It just took her 50 years to get there. 49, Margaret corrected automatically. You'll be 55 in 3 months, Mom. Math isn't optional. Margaret sighed dramatically. My daughter, everyone, keeping me humble since 1998. Someone has to, Emma said, but her tone was affectionate. Seriously though, Derek, what made you realize you were interested in someone so much older than you? Most guys your age are terrified of women with actual life experience. The question was direct in a way that seemed characteristically Emma, but it made me think seriously about my answer. Honestly, your mom is the first person I've met who seems genuinely comfortable with herself. She knows what she likes, what she wants, and what she won't tolerate. There's something incredibly attractive about that level of self-awareness. And the age thing doesn't weird you out? Emma pressed. Emma, Margaret warned, but I could tell she was curious about my answer too. Sometimes I'm aware of it, I admitted. Like when your mom mentions historical events she lived through that I only learned about in school, or when she references cultural things from before I was born. But mostly it just feels like she has more context for understanding the world, which makes conversations more interesting. Emma nodded thoughtfully. I think that's healthy. When Mom first started dating after the divorce, she went out with a few guys her own age who seemed threatened by how much she'd grown as a person. They wanted the version of her from 20 years ago, not the person she'd become. Those relationships didn't last long, Margaret said dryly. What were those guys like? I asked, realizing I was curious about Margaret's dating history but had never felt comfortable asking directly. Margaret and Emma exchanged a look that suggested this was a topic they'd discussed before. Let's see, Margaret said, settling back in her chair. There was David, who was recently divorced and spent our entire first date complaining about his ex-wife. There was Michael, who kept trying to convince me that I should move to his neighborhood because it was more appropriate for someone my age. And there was Robert, who asked me on our second date if I was interested in settling down again, because he was looking for a wife to help him entertain clients. Yikes, I said. The worst part, Emma added, was that these were supposed to be the good ones. Mom's friends kept setting her up with stable, established men who turned out to be looking for housekeepers and hostesses, not partners. It was educational, Margaret said philosophically. I learned that I'd rather be alone than with someone who sees me as a collection of useful functions rather than an actual person. Is that why you stopped dating for a while? I asked. Partly, but also because I realized I was approaching dating like a job interview, trying to present the version of myself I thought men would want, rather than just being myself and seeing who was genuinely interested in that person. Emma leaned forward with interest. That's exactly what I was doing with Jake. Trying to be the kind of girlfriend I thought he wanted instead of just being myself and letting him decide if he liked the real me. It's a hard pattern to break, Margaret said, especially when you've spent years adapting yourself to other people's expectations. As the evening progressed, I found myself fascinated by the dynamic between Margaret and Emma. They talked to each other like equals, sharing insights about relationships and personal growth with a candor that spoke to years of building trust and mutual respect. Emma asked her mother for advice, but she also challenged Margaret's assumptions and offered her own perspectives on Margaret's experiences. Can I ask you something? Emma said to me as Margaret went inside to get more wine. Are you planning to stick around? Or is this just a temporary thing while you figure out what you really want? The question caught me off guard with its directness. Why do you ask? Because my mom has been hurt enough by people who weren't sure about her. She deserves someone who's excited about being with her, not someone who's just experimenting with dating an older woman. The protective edge in Emma's voice made me realize how carefully she'd been observing our interactions all week. I'm not experimenting, I said honestly. I can't predict what's going to happen long term, but I can tell you that I've never been more interested in getting to know someone better. Good, Emma said, her expression softening. Because she lights up when she talks about you, and I haven't seen her do that since, well, maybe ever. Even when she was married to my dad, she never seemed as genuinely happy as she does now. Margaret returned with a fresh bottle of wine and immediately picked up on the serious energy between Emma and me. What did I miss? Nothing, Emma said innocently. Just getting to know Derek better. My daughter is very protective, Margaret said to me. I hope she wasn't too intense. Just the right amount of intensity, I assured her. It's nice to know you have someone looking out for you. The conversation shifted to lighter topics. But Emma's words stayed with me for the rest of the evening. The idea that Margaret seemed happier now than she had during her marriage was both encouraging and sobering. It made me realize that what we were building together mattered not just to us, but to the people who cared about Margaret's well-being. Friday evening, Emma returned to Dallas, but not before extracting promises from both Margaret and me to keep her updated on how things developed between us. As we waved goodbye from Margaret's driveway, I realized that meeting Emma had fundamentally changed how I understood my relationship with Margaret. It was no longer just two people exploring a connection. It was something that existed within a broader context of family and history and other people's investment in Margaret's happiness. Thank you for being so wonderful with her, Margaret said as we walked back into the house. Emma's opinion matters a lot to me, and she clearly adores you. She's incredible, smart, funny, protective of you in all the right ways. You've obviously done an amazing job raising her. I had a lot of help from circumstances. Emma was always an easy kid, curious, empathetic, willing to communicate about problems instead of acting out. I got lucky. I don't think luck had much to do with it. She talks about you with such respect and affection. That doesn't happen by accident. Margaret settled onto her couch, curling her legs under her in a way that made her look younger and more relaxed. Being her mother has been the most rewarding part of my life, but also the most challenging, especially after the divorce, when I was trying to figure out how to be a good parent while also rebuilding my own identity. What was that like for Emma? Confusing, I think. She was used to me being very focused on the family's needs, and suddenly, I was taking pottery classes and going on solo trips and making decisions based on what I wanted rather than what everyone else expected. She handled it well, but there were definitely moments when she wondered if I was having some kind of midlife crisis. Were you? Margaret laughed. Probably. Though I prefer to think of it as a midlife awakening. For the first time in decades, I was making choices based on my own interests and values rather than trying to maintain some external image of what my life should look like. Do you ever regret it? The divorce, I mean. Never, she said without hesitation. I regret that it took me so long to find the courage to leave, and I regret that Emma had to watch her parents be unhappy for as long as she did. But I don't regret choosing authenticity over security. We were sitting close enough on the couch that I could smell her perfume, something subtle and sophisticated that seemed to capture her personality perfectly. The house was quiet around us, and I found myself acutely aware that this was the first time we'd been completely alone since Emma's arrival. Derek, Margaret said softly, can I ask you something? Of course. What are you hoping for? With us, I mean. Emma's questions this week made me realize we've been avoiding some important conversations. The question I'd been dreading and anticipating in equal measure had finally arrived. I took a breath and decided to be as honest as possible. I'm hoping for whatever comes naturally. I don't have a timeline or specific expectations, but I know I want to keep spending time with you and getting to know you better. I know I'm more interested in you than I've been in anyone in a very long time, even though I come with complications. A daughter who's protective, a past that includes a long marriage, social situations where people are going to make assumptions. About us? Especially because of those things, I said, surprising myself with the certainty in my voice. Margaret, you're not a consolation prize or a temporary distraction. You're someone I genuinely care about, and everything that comes with you, Emma, your history, even the social complications, is part of what makes you who you are. She was quiet for a long moment, studying my face as if she was trying to determine whether I meant what I'd just said. I need you to understand something, she said finally. I'm not looking for someone to take care of me or someone to fill a void in my life. I've learned to be happy on my own, which means if I'm going to be with someone, it's because they add something valuable to an already good life. What would be valuable to you? Partnership. Someone who sees me clearly and likes what they see. Someone who has their own interests and passions but enjoys sharing experiences with me. Someone who understands that love at this stage of life looks different from what it looks like when you're 25 and everything feels urgent and dramatic. How does it look different? Margaret shifted closer to me on the couch, and I could see the firelight from the patio reflected in her eyes through the open door. It's more intentional. Less about need and more about choice. Less about completing each other and more about complementing each other. When you've already learned to be whole on your own, being with someone becomes about enhancing your life rather than filling gaps in it. The way she described mature love made something click into place for me. This was what had been missing from my previous relationships, the sense that we were choosing each other from a place of wholeness rather than trying to fix something broken or fill something empty. That sounds incredible, I said honestly. It is, Margaret said with a smile that made my heart skip. But it also requires both people to be emotionally mature enough to handle that level of intentionality. Are you ready for something like that? Looking at her face in the soft light, feeling the weight of everything we'd shared over the past month, I realized that I'd never been more ready for anything in my life. Yes, I said. I want exactly that. With you. Margaret leaned forward and kissed me then, softly and deliberately, in a way that felt like a promise and a question all at once. When we separated, she rested her forehead against mine and smiled. Good, she said quietly, because I was hoping you'd say that. The kiss changed something fundamental between us, shifting us from whatever we'd been before to something new and acknowledged. As we sat together on her couch, talking quietly about plans for the weekend and the Scotland trip she was still planning for spring, I realized that Margaret had given me something I hadn't even known I was looking for. The possibility of a relationship built on mutual choice rather than mutual need, where both people brought their whole selves to something they were creating together. Would you like to stay tonight? Margaret asked as the evening grew late. I have a guest room, or... She trailed off, leaving the choice to me. I'd like to stay, I said. Wherever you're comfortable with me staying. My room, she said without hesitation. If that's what you want too. As we turned off the lights and headed upstairs together, I thought about Emma's question earlier in the week about whether I was planning to stick around. Looking at Margaret in the hallway outside her bedroom, her silver hair catching the moonlight. From the window, I couldn't imagine wanting to be anywhere else. 6 months later, I was standing in Margaret's kitchen making coffee, while she sat at her laptop planning the final details of her Scotland trip. What had started as a solo adventure had evolved into something we were doing together. Not because she needed a companion, but because we'd both realized that sharing new experiences had become one of our favorite things about being together. The cottage I booked has a fireplace and overlooks Loch Katrine, Margaret said, scrolling through photos on the rental website. The owner says May is perfect timing for hiking without the summer crowds. How long has it been since you've been hiking? I asked, setting a cup of coffee next to her laptop. About 15 years. Richard thought hiking was pointless exercise when you could get the same workout at a gym. I used to love it when I was younger, but I gradually stopped doing things he didn't enjoy. She looked up at me with a grin. I'm probably going to be terrible at it. Then we'll be terrible at it together. I haven't hiked anything more challenging than the trails around Zilker Park. The ease with which we'd started planning a 2-week international trip together still surprised me sometimes. There had been no dramatic relationship milestones or heavy conversations about taking things to the next level. Instead, Margaret had mentioned the Scotland trip during one of our Saturday morning farmers market visits. I'd expressed interest in joining her, and within a week we were researching flights and adjusting the itinerary to accommodate both our interests. Emma's excited about house-sitting, Margaret said, closing the laptop. She's been looking for an excuse to spend more time in Austin, and watching the place gives her a reason to take a few weeks off work. Is she still seeing that guy from her book club? Marcus, yes. They seem to be taking things very slowly, which I think is smart after her experience with Jake. She's learned to pay attention to how relationships feel rather than how they look on paper. The mention of Emma made me think about how naturally I'd been absorbed into Margaret's family life. Emma and I had developed our own friendship independent of Margaret, texting about work frustrations and sharing restaurant recommendations. When she visited Austin, the three of us fell into easy routines of cooking together and exploring the city. There was none of the awkwardness I'd experienced in previous relationships where meeting the family felt like an audition. What time? Is your mom's birthday dinner on Sunday? I asked, checking my phone for messages. 4 o'clock. And thank you again for agreeing to meet the extended family. I know it's going to be overwhelming. Margaret's mother was turning 78, and the celebration would include aunts, uncles, cousins, and family friends spanning several generations. Margaret had warned me that there would be questions about our age difference and probably some well-meaning but intrusive commentary about our relationship. Are you nervous about it? She asked. A little, I admitted. Not about meeting them, but about the questions. I still don't have a good answer when people ask about the age thing. What do you mean? People always want to know if it bothers me that you're older, or if I think about the future implications, or if my parents approve. The honest answer is that most of the time I forget there's an age difference at all. But that doesn't seem to satisfy people's curiosity. Margaret set down her coffee and looked at me thoughtfully. It's because most people can't imagine being attracted to someone outside their expected demographic. They assume there must be some hidden motivation or psychological explanation. Is there a psychological explanation, I mean? Probably. Though I think it has more to do with compatibility than age. You were ready for a relationship with substance and intention, which isn't common among men your age. I was ready for someone who saw me as I am now rather than as a project to be improved or a trophy to be displayed. The fact that we're at different life stages matters less than the fact that we want similar things from a partnership. What do we want? Companionship without codependence. Shared experiences without losing our individual identities. Someone to build memories with, who also encourages us to pursue our own interests. She paused to sip her coffee. And really excellent conversation, which is rarer than you might think. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the front door. Margaret wasn't expecting anyone, but when she opened it, we found Emma standing on the porch with an overnight bag and a bottle of wine, grinning broadly. Surprise! I got off work early and thought I'd drive down for the weekend. I brought that Pinot Noir you like, Mom. Emma. What a wonderful surprise, Margaret said, hugging her daughter. Derek and I were just talking about Scotland and your grandmother's birthday. Perfect timing then. I have opinions about both topics. As Emma settled into the living room with us, I marveled again at how comfortable these family moments had become. 6 months ago, I would never have imagined spending a Friday evening discussing international travel plans with a woman 26 years older than me and her daughter who was essentially my peer. Now it felt like the most natural thing in the world. So, Marcus isn't joining you this weekend? Margaret asked as Emma poured wine for all three of us. He's visiting his sister in San Antonio. Which is fine. I wanted some one-on-one time. With you guys anyway. Plus, I have news. Good news or concerning news? Margaret asked with the automatic wariness of a parent. Good news. I got the promotion I interviewed for last month. Senior account manager, significant raise, my own office. With actual windows. Emma, that's fantastic, I said, genuinely excited for her. When do you start? Monday. Which means I'll have more flexibility for vacation time. So if you and Mom need a third wheel for any portion of the Scotland trip, I'm available. Margaret and I exchanged a look. We'd talked about Emma potentially joining us for part of the trip, but hadn't mentioned it to her yet. Actually, Margaret said, we were thinking about suggesting exactly that. Maybe the second week? You could fly over and meet us in Edinburgh and we could explore the city together before Derek and I head home. Really? That would be amazing. I've been wanting to visit Scotland since I read Outlander, though I promise not to spend the entire time looking for Jamie Fraser. No promises necessary, I said with a laugh. Margaret's already admitted she's hoping to find some Highland scenery that looks like the show. It's called inspiration for photography, Margaret said with mock dignity. Completely different from tourist fantasy. As the evening progressed, Emma filled us in on her new job, her developing relationship with Marcus, and her plans for using Margaret's house as a base for exploring Austin's music scene during our Scotland trip. The conversation flowed easily between the three of us, covering everything from work stress to travel logistics to Emma's latest attempt at learning to cook. Can I ask you guys something? Emma said as we finished our second bottle of wine. Do you ever get weird reactions from people about your relationship? Sometimes, Margaret said. Mostly from people our own ages who have strong opinions about appropriate behavior for women over 50. What kind of opinions? Emma asked. That I should be more concerned with being a dignified grandmother-in-waiting than pursuing romance with a younger man. That I'm somehow being undignified or desperate by dating someone of Derek's age. That's ridiculous, Emma said with the fierce loyalty I'd come to recognize as characteristic of their relationship. You're happy, Derek's happy, you're both consenting adults who enjoy each other's company. What could possibly be undignified about that? Ageism disguised as concern for propriety, I said. People seem to think there's an expiration date on women's right to be attractive and desirable. Exactly, Margaret said. If Derek were 54 and I were 28, no one would blink an eye. But because I'm the older partner, people assume there's something inappropriate or predatory about our relationship. Have you gotten negative reactions from your friends? Emma asked. A few. Most of my close friends are happy for me, but there have been some comments about robbing the cradle or concerns that I'm going to get hurt when Derek realizes he wants someone his own age. I felt a familiar flash of irritation at the assumption that I was inevitably going to leave Margaret for a younger woman. Those comments say more about the people making them than about our relationship. What about your friends, Derek? Emma asked. Do they understand what you see in Mom? The ones who've met your mom absolutely understand. She's charming, intelligent, accomplished, and beautiful. The ones who haven't met her sometimes make assumptions based on stereotypes about older women, but those usually disappear once they spend time with us together. Good, Emma said with satisfaction. Because anyone who has a problem with you two being together is probably not worth having as a friend anyway. The fierce protectiveness in Emma's voice reminded me of her confrontation with me weeks earlier, about my intentions toward Margaret. She'd appointed herself guardian of her mother's happiness, and she took that role seriously. Speaking of friends, Margaret said, Derek's been invited to join my book club next month. We're reading a mystery set in Scotland which seemed appropriately timed. The Wine Bar Book Club? Emma asked with obvious delight. Oh, this is going to be fun. Those women are going to love interrogating you, Derek. Fair warning, they're all incredibly smart, and they've been protective of Mom since her divorce. Any advice for surviving the interrogation? I asked. Be yourself, Emma said simply. They'll be able to tell if you're putting on an act, and they'll respect honesty even if they don't initially approve of the age difference. What they really want to know, Margaret added, is whether you see me as a person or as a novelty. Once they're convinced it's the former, you'll be fine. Sunday afternoon arrived with unseasonable warmth for October in Austin. Margaret's mother's birthday celebration was being held at a country club in West Austin, and as we pulled into the parking lot, I could see multiple generations of Margaret's extended family gathered on the patio overlooking a small lake. Last chance to change your mind, Margaret said as she checked her lipstick in the rearview mirror. Not happening, I said, squeezing her hand. I want to meet the people who shaped you into who you are. Margaret's mother, Dorothy, turned out to be a petite woman with steel-gray hair and Margaret's same intelligent eyes. She greeted me with genuine warmth and immediately launched into questions about my work, my family, and my impressions of Austin. Within minutes, I found myself in animated conversation with her about the city's growth and the challenges of preserving its character while accommodating new residents. You have strong opinions about urban planning for someone your age, Dorothy observed with obvious approval. I care about the places I live. Austin's been good to me, and I want it to remain the kind of city that attracts people like your daughter. Smooth answer, she said with a smile that reminded me exactly of Margaret's. Mischievous expressions, but accurate, I think. Margaret seems happier than she's been in years. The afternoon unfolded with the gentle chaos of large family gatherings. I was introduced to aunts who wanted to know about my career prospects, uncles who tested my knowledge of Austin history, and cousins who were clearly trying to figure out whether my relationship with Margaret was serious or temporary. The questions were direct but not hostile, and I found myself appreciating the family's protectiveness of Margaret. So, said Margaret's Aunt Patricia during a lull in conversation, what do your parents think about you dating someone with a grown daughter? The question I'd been expecting all afternoon had finally arrived. They were surprised initially, I said honestly. But they've met Margaret now, and they understand why I'm so drawn to her. My mom actually said Margaret reminds her of herself at that age, confident, accomplished, and clear about what she wants from life. And they don't have concerns about the age difference? They had questions, which was natural. But once they spent time with us together, they could see that we're genuinely compatible. My dad told me afterward that he'd never seen me as relaxed and happy in a relationship. Patricia nodded thoughtfully. Age is just a number when two people truly connect. My late husband was 8 years younger than me, and we had 43 wonderful years together before he passed. As the afternoon wound down and family members began saying their goodbyes, Dorothy pulled me aside for a private conversation. "Derek," she said, "I want you to know how grateful I am that Margaret found you." She went through a very difficult period after her divorce, questioning many of her choices and wondering if she'd ever find real partnership again. You've given her back her confidence and love. She's given me much more than I've given her, I said sincerely. Margaret taught me what it means to choose someone from a place of strength rather than need. That's exactly what she needed. Someone who appreciates her wholeness rather than trying to fix her perceived flaws. Her ex-husband spent 20 years trying to modify her personality to suit his preferences. You seem to genuinely like who she is. I more than like who she is. I'm consistently amazed by her intelligence, her creativity, her resilience, and her capacity for joy. Being with Margaret has made me a better version of myself. Dorothy smiled and patted my arm. Then you're exactly what she deserves. As we drove home through the Austin twilight, Margaret was quiet in a way that suggested she was processing the afternoon's interactions. "How do you think that went?" I asked. "Better than I expected. My family can be overwhelming, but they seemed to genuinely like you." Aunt Patricia's comparison to her marriage with Uncle Robert was high praise. She's notoriously difficult to impress. "Your mom is incredible. I can see where you get your directness and your warmth. She likes you too. She told me while you were talking to my cousin James that you seem solid and thoughtful, which is her highest compliment for potential romantic partners. What about you? How are you feeling about everything?" Margaret was quiet for a long moment, watching the familiar Austin neighborhoods pass by outside her window. "Grateful," she said finally. 6 months ago, I thought I'd found peace with being alone. I was content with my independence and my freedom to make choices based solely on my own preferences. I never imagined I'd meet someone who would enhance that independence rather than threaten it. Is that what this feels like? Enhancement rather than compromise? Exactly. You've never asked me to change anything about myself or my life. Instead, you've shown interest in understanding why I make the choices I do, and you've found ways to complement those choices rather than compete with them. That's incredibly rare. You've done the same thing for me. Before I met you, I was going through the motions of adult life without really understanding what I wanted it to look like. Watching you live so intentionally made me realize I could be more deliberate about building a life that actually reflects my values. What values? Authenticity, connection, continuous learning, experiences over possessions. Things I thought I cared about but weren't really prioritizing until I saw you living them every day. We'd reached Margaret's house, but neither of us made a move to get out of the car. The conversation felt too important to interrupt with the mundane task of going inside. "Derek," Margaret said softly, "I want you to know that whatever happens, with us long-term, meeting you has fundamentally changed how I think about relationships and partnership. You've shown me that it's possible to be completely myself with another person, which I didn't think existed after my marriage ended. Are you worried about long-term sustainability?" "Sometimes. Not because of anything wrong with our relationship, but because the practical realities of our age difference will become more significant as time passes. I'll be 60 when you're 38. I'll be 70 when you're 48. Those aren't just numbers. They represent different life stages and potentially different needs." The honesty in her voice made my chest tighten. We'd skirted around this conversation before, but tonight felt like the right time to address it directly. "Margaret," I said, turning to face her fully, "I can't predict what either of us will want or need in 10 or 20 years. But I can tell you that right now, in this moment, I can't imagine wanting to build a future with anyone but you. If that changes for either of us, we'll deal with it honestly when it happens. But I'm not going to limit what we create together based on hypothetical problems we might face someday. What if people are right? What if you wake up one day and realize you want someone your own age who can give you children and decades of shared experiences? What if you wake up one day and realize you want someone with more life experience who shares your cultural references and remembers the same historical events? I countered. We could spend all our time worrying about what might go wrong, or we can focus on building something meaningful while we have the chance. Margaret smiled at my response, and some of the tension left her shoulders. You're right. I spent too many years in a marriage where we were constantly managing potential future problems instead of enjoying what we had. I don't want to make that mistake again. So we take it one day at a time? One day at a time, she agreed. Starting with Scotland in 3 weeks. As we finally headed inside, I thought about how much had changed since that awkward encounter in the grocery store checkout line. What had started as a moment of mutual misunderstanding had evolved into something neither of us had expected, but both of us had needed. Margaret had taught me that real partnership wasn't about finding someone to complete you, but about choosing someone who enhanced the person you already were. In return, I'd apparently given her permission to be loved exactly as she was, without modification or apology. 2 weeks later, as our plane lifted off from Austin Bergstrom Airport bound for Edinburgh, Margaret reached for my hand and smiled. Ready? For an adventure? She asked. With you, I'm ready for anything. Looking back now, I realized that our relationship began the moment Margaret laughed at my assumption about her age and decided to educate me rather than dismiss me. Everything that followed, the jazz club, the farmer's market, meeting Emma, navigating family dynamics, planning international travel, was simply the natural progression of two people choosing each other repeatedly, one conversation at a time. We never did figure out a perfect answer to other people's questions about our age difference. Instead, we learned to focus on the questions that actually mattered. Do we enjoy each other's company? Do we support each other's growth? Do we choose each other freely, from a place of strength rather than need? Are we building something together that enhances both our individual lives? The answer to all of those questions was yes. Everything else was just details. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.